Hi, my name's Chris Thomas, and welcome to DVD 2 in our Modeling Fundamental series for 3ds Max. In the previous DVD in this series, we looked at basic scene navigation, working with primitives, the very basics of modeling really in 3ds Max, how to use pivots, what pivots are, how coordinate systems work, what was the home grid, how could we build objects on the home grid, and then we looked at other things such as creating custom home grids, using the snap system, using auto snaps, things like that. And towards the end of that DVD, we moved on and we modeled some elements of our go-kart project, which is something that we'll be returning to towards the end of this DVD. In the first DVD, we just model elements using basic primitives. I created some template primitives, and then I went in and replaced those primitives to start off with better versions, basically beveled versions, so they look nicer. So when you render, you get nicer looking geometry. And then I showed you how you could actually deform some of those elements and model them using modifiers such as bend. Now, in this DVD, we're going to move on. We're going to look at mesh editing. And mesh editing is very important because these days, if you work at a film studio, if you work at a game studio, if you work at an architect, at any one of those places, some polymodeling skills are going to be very important. The level of importance depends on the actual venue. At a architect, it's slightly less important than at a film studio and a game studio, but still, these days it's a very important skill, no matter what environment you find yourself working in. You really do need to be able to polymodel to one degree or another. Now, polymodeling actually isn't very difficult. As I've said in the previous DVD, when I first started modeling in 3ds Max, and especially before 3ds Max in packages like 3D Studio, mesh editing actually was quite difficult. The tools weren't very mature. The only real way that you could actually model with polygons was by creating primitives and then deforming them in some way, and also using some of the spline based tools to actually create a mesh in exactly the shape that you wanted it to be in. These days things are a lot more fluid. The poly editing tools in 3ds Max are excellent. It's much easier to actually work towards something in a more sort of organic manner. Start off with a mesh which isn't exactly what you want, but then molding it like clay until you arrive at a shape that you're happy with. Now, the remit of this DVD isn't such that we're going to be modeling at that kind of level. We're not really going to be doing organic modeling. After all, I'm trying to teach you the fundamentals here. So what I'm going to be running through is more the structure of edit meshes, what makes those distinct from edit polys, and then we'll look at basic themes, things like how can we attach meshes together, how can we break them apart, how can we manipulate meshes using the soft selection tool, what are such things as smoothing groups, why are they important, and then we'll move on and we'll look at the edit poly. Why is it different from the edit mesh? What are the different elements that you'll find inside an edit poly? And then we look at the reason for having edit poly, which is being able to select edges in a ring and also in a loop, and being able to work with those quickly. This was the whole reason that edit poly was actually added to 3ds Max. So it's important that we quickly look at that. But those tools can be used for basic poly modeling, and we will actually use some of those tools later on in this DVD in our go-kart modeling project. But they really come into their own when you start working with sub-D modeling, and that's really where selecting edge rings and then connecting them together to create loops really comes together. So, that's something, as I said, we'll hit on much more so in DVD 4 in this series, where we look at sub-Ds. And then later on in the DVD, we'll go back to our go-kart project and I'll actually build a frame. This is something that I previewed in DVD 1 in the series. You know what the frame looks like by now. Well, in this DVD, we're actually going to model it. It's not particularly complex, but we're going to build a frame just from one cube. So it's going to be classic poly modeling. Something that some people would say was, sub-D modeling, but really I'm just extruding things, and this has been in 3ds Max for a very long time. So it's just basically classic poly modeling. And then later in that section, we'll go in and we'll refine that mesh and bevel it and basically make it a little bit more sophisticated in certain areas. At the end of the day, the final model is not going to be incredibly complex. It's not going to be, hugely great quality, but it will give you a basic idea of how you can actually do your mesh editing. And then we'll wrap up in this DVD by looking at some modeling tips and organization techniques, which I've kind of rolled together into this DVD. Before we look at the running order of this DVD, I just want to give you a quick example of what I see poly modeling as being to you in your toolkit. This analogy may not work perfectly, but it'll kind of give you the idea of why poly modeling is so important. In the first DVD, we worked with primitives, and if we imagined we were building a car engine, let's say, you can imagine the primitives as being elements of that car engine: a tube, a cylinder, a gasket, a clip, tubes, things like that. Pre-made objects that we can deform just like a rubber tube. We can bend it a bit and we can put it into different shapes. But at the end of the day, we're kind of really stuck with those basic objects. We can't really do anything much more with it. Where mesh editing comes in is that it allows us to take those basic elements and weld them together. So that's the first thing we can do with mesh editing. We can take two primitives, join them together, then weld, literally put in, like a weld and actually make them so that they blend together into one shape. And then if you wanted to at a later date, you could actually get part of that mesh and detach it, break it off again. Effectively, we've got this ability to sort of bring objects together and smooth them, and also to break them apart if we want to. So we've got that kind of power. So as I said, it's a kind of, like a virtual welding system. The other thing it gives you is, it gives you total flexibility in that you can create any shape that you want. So if a primitive doesn't really give you what you want, you need a very distinct organic shape. Poly modeling will allow you to do that. You can pretty much model anything with polys. But to do that, really, you're talking more about sub-Ds. And as I said, in this DVD, we're not really looking at subdivision modeling. That's going to be looked at in DVD 4. So for now, we're just going to be looking at the basics, but it should get you going along the road of mesh editing. DVD 4 will actually push you a lot further in that area. So anyway, let's get back to this DVD, and let me just quickly run through what we'll be looking at in order before we make a start on Chapter 1. So in our first chapter, we'll be looking at edit meshes, which is the original mesh type in 3ds Max. We'll just be looking at the basic sub-elements of the edit mesh. By sub-elements, I mean, what is it actually made up of? We'll be looking at things like vertices, edges, faces, elements, things like that. What is it exactly that constructs the edit mesh and allows it to exist? Then in the next chapter, we'll move on and we'll actually create some faces for the first time. We'll put some vertices down and then we'll join the vertices together with edges. And when we get 3 edges, we'll actually have a face. So for the first one, we'll actually be truly mesh editing and modeling it in effect. And then in the next chapter, we'll look at something which I just alluded to, which is being able to actually attach objects together and also detach them. So we'll find how we can get, 2 spheres, 2 cubes, and actually attach them together so they form one single mesh. This is a very fundamental thing in 3ds Max and most packages, but it's very easy to do. And anyway, we'll be looking at it in that chapter. And then in the next section of the DVD, we'll still be actually using edit meshes, but we'll be looking at soft selections. This is something which is not actually specific just to edit meshes, because in edit polys, we also have soft selections. So that's why I described this as being the next section. It's not actually specifically about edit meshes. And then in the next chapter, we'll be looking at smoothing groups. And smoothing groups are basically sets of faces that have been defined to be in a group. And what 3ds Max then does is it does a Phong smoothing algorithm between those faces. So it gives the impression that rather than them being flat facets, it gives the impression that they're actually a nice, smooth, flowing surface. And in 3ds Max, we have this system called smoothing groups, which actually allows you to define groups of faces that actually attempt to, be smoothed together. And that's something we'll be looking at, some detail in that chapter. We'll be moving on to the next section of the DVD, where we start to look at the edit poly. We kind of recap what we did in chapter 1, but in this case, we're looking at the structure of the edit poly. So again, edit poly is made up of verts and edges, but when we put these edges together, we can build polygons, true polygons, instead of only the triangles that you can actually build with the edit mesh. And we also have a border as well, which is a special element type for editable poly. So again, I'll explain what that's all about in that chapter. And then the edit poly was designed for a specific reason, and we'll be looking at that reason in the next chapter. And that's actually selecting edges in a ring, which is basically, if you can imagine edges side onto each other, going all the way around a tube, and also being able to select loops. And that's like basically a group of edges which connected to each other end to end, basically like a chain. And these are 2 of the most basic selection types when you're doing sub-D modeling and also poly modeling. You can select an edge ring, And when you get a group of edges, which are edge on, you can then connect them together with a new edge, and this gives you what's called a loop. And you can then get that loop and you can shrink it down to create a pinch in the surface, or you can expand it upwards, whatever. But basically, when you create all those new edges by connecting the original edges together, you're creating a subdivision, and this is where you get the phrase subdivision modeling from. So it's a pretty fundamental thing, being able to actually select and connect and, in effect, subdivide in that manner. So once we've wrapped up on that, we'll basically have the skills that we really need to go on into the next section of the DVD, where we go back to our go-kart project and we build the frame. What I'll be doing here is actually building the frame out of a single cube. We'll just be extruding and subdividing in some areas using the techniques that I just described, selecting an edge, a group of edges, and then connecting them together to create a new loop. And then using the faces that we've just created, by doing that, we can then extrude out new parts of the frame. So it directly uses the skills that we've learned in the previous few chapters. In the first chapter in that section, we'll basically be building a template and renaming elements of the template, getting things organized really, so that the next few chapters are all very well planned out and easy to do. Towards the end of that first chapter of the section, we'll actually build the basic parts of the frame. We won't actually complete the frame at that point. We'll just have the main part of it made. Then in the next chapter, we'll move on and we'll make the upper parts of the frame and slightly more difficult areas of the frame. We'll weld certain areas together, as it were. Obviously, it's not real welding, but we'll use polygons to connect parts of the mesh together. So it's a kind of virtual welding, if you can imagine that. In the last chapter in this section, we'll get the frame, and we'll bevel it, and we'll round corners, and we'll basically polish it and produce a nicer looking model. And this goes along the same theme as something that we looked at in the first DVD, where we took the basic mesh that we modeled and we beveled the corners. Well, we're going to do the same thing with the frame. It's very important that you put in bevels so that when you render it, you get nice smooth corners. We're not going to go away from that basic principle in this DVD. It's an important thing when you're modeling to do that, and I'm certainly going to show you how to do that in this DVD. That's quite an important thing to look at. And then we'll wrap up this DVD with 2 chapters which are kind of related. The first chapter is modeling tips, and it's just a grab bag there of basic tips about modeling, best practices, things that I would do when I was modeling. And I thought it was important at this point in DVD 2, we're kind of halfway through the series, that I start putting in some basic principles. They're not necessarily related to any one type of modeling. These principles aren't about mesh editing in particular. They're not really about primitive modeling or splines or sub-Ds. These are just generic tips that can be used throughout any kind of modeling workflow. At the end of that section, we'll be looking at organization techniques. How can we name parts of the mesh to make it easier to work with? How can we use layers? How can we use name selection sets? Things like that. It's all, pretty important stuff, pretty cool. So I think that'll be pretty interesting for you. And that'll be it for the DVD. As you can see, we've got a huge amount of stuff to cover yet again in this DVD. I think that's a theme in this series. The amount of ground that we've got to cover is massive. But I think it's very enjoyable. I think, modeling's a very enjoyable subject, and it's something which I'm pretty passionate about, and I enjoy modeling as a process, and it's very rewarding. So anyway, let's make a start with this DVD. Let's go on to chapter 1, where we'll start exploring the editable mesh.